First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Musqueam First Nation on whose lands we are gathered. Thank you very much to everyone that made this possible. We were here earlier in the day and did another presentation, and that was some great questions came out of that. So thank you to all of those who made it happen. It's a privilege and an honor to share my book with you. In my book, I also want to thank my daughter, Jacinda Mack, and my husband, Bill Wilson, who contributed valuable pieces to the book, and Bill will say a few words after I finish. So I am not a writer by choice, but by necessity. When I was growing up as a youth and even later as an adult, I heard all the racist remarks about Aboriginal people. My young ears heard all the comments about how Aboriginal people were all welfare recipients, they were all drunks, they were all lazy, they were all stupid, they were all dirty, and more derogatory comments. The myths also included Aboriginal people getting everything for free. I am still looking for that reserve and just might transfer there when I find it. And I've been looking for years and I haven't found it yet. So I knew that the remarks were not true, but I didn't know how to respond to them when I was younger. There's a saying in the Aboriginal world that if you were born Aboriginal, you were born into politics, whether you like it or not. I don't consider myself a politician and would never choose that as a career. So in becoming a writer and former chief of my community, I was acting on the inherited commitment to the fight for justice for my people. The reason I wrote my first book, They Called Me Number One, and now Price Paid, The Fight for First Nations Survival, was that I felt I could give those Aboriginal people who were like me at one time the tools to correct the comments that are made. Ignorance about others many times turns into racism. When you don't understand someone's journey, it's easy to judge based only on what you see or what you hear. But if you have the opportunity to give others knowledge, you also give them the ability to understand. As an Aboriginal person, I knew that Canadian history, as it was being taught in the schools, was not accurate. I also knew that unless Aboriginal people started including their history from their point of view, that the incomplete and sometimes totally inaccurate history would continue to be taught. Other Aboriginal people in the Americas have done a great job of correcting some of the dominant society's version of history, but more writing by Indigenous people is needed. My book is meant as an overview, to get people talking, and not as a detailed historical account. I have a history degree and a law degree. I was chief of my community for 12 years, but worked in one capacity or another for my community most of my life. The various jobs over the years certainly opened my eyes to the oppressive nature of the Department of Indian Affairs, now called Indigenous and Northern Affairs. I have structured the book around the central metaphor of a household. Each chapter opens with a question about the house. Almost everyone has a house or at least some place they can call home. Even homeless people have a space that they call their own. One expects that when guests come, they are respectful to the original homeowners. I believe it is easier for people to understand how Aboriginal people feel about their homelands and colonization when I put it in those terms. So I will begin interchanging thoughts and passages from the chapter. Chapter 1. What if you owned a house and a beautiful garden? Would you share it with others? Would you welcome them? When the newcomers first came from Europe, the population of the Aboriginal peoples in the Americas were solid, secure, and strong. Aboriginal people occupied the land from the North Pole to the tip of South America. They had strict, formal forms of conduct that governed every aspect of their lives. Births, deaths, marriages, land titles, songs, dances, conflicts, and all personal conduct were governed by such institutions as the potlatch, the sun dance, and other sacred ceremonies that had existed for thousands of years. The question of how many Aboriginal people lived in the Americas before the newcomers came is not agreed upon. The latest estimates are that 90 to 112 million Aboriginal people lived in North, Central, and South America. Aboriginal societies engaged in an economy that respected the land and all its bounty, from the plants that grow in the earth to the animals that walk in the forests and the fish and other foods that make their homes in the waters. Over thousands of years in the Americas, we had developed an intimate knowledge of the land that led to thriving economies. And Aboriginal people had a culture of sharing. In Aboriginal languages, there is no word for please. As one elder says, we did not have to beg for anything. Sharing was expected, and gathering as much as you could for yourself was, in the Aboriginal world, a crime. 1% of the population did not accumulate all of the wealth and control the rest of society. It was not a utopia, as some of the Europeans first saw it. There were tribal wars, and, as in other parts of the world, there probably were hard times, but the tribes shared the good and the bad times. Chapter 2. What if your guests decided to stay? Would it still be your house? Who would not want to stay in a land of plenty with the individual freedom found here? Aboriginal societies were not subjects of their chiefs and leaders. The chiefs and leaders did not individually reign over the territory and over their people. The decisions were made on a collective basis. The newcomers knew they needed something to establish their place in the house, and so, when the King of England in the Royal Proclamation of 1763 recognized our inherent title to the land, the proclamation stated that Aboriginal people were not to be molested or disturbed in their lands. Territories not already ceded or purchased by the British Crown would be reserved for Aboriginal people, and only the British Crown could acquire these lands through treaty negotiations. Treaties were made with the British Crown, establishing the character and reach of Aboriginal rights and title throughout parts of Canada, and especially in the prairies. For different reasons, the treaty process was not completed. So today, many parts of Canada, and as you probably all know, a big part of British Columbia, still have no treaties for traditional Aboriginal lands. All the while violating their own English common law and the Crown's policy in regard to Aboriginal nations, the newcomers set up governments and claimed land across Canada. In many places, they did not make treaties with the Aboriginal people as the Royal Proclamation instructed them to, but yet they still sold the land to newly arrived settlers and did not share any profits with the Aboriginal people. Chapter 3. What if you woke up one morning and found your family had died? Would it be right for the newcomers to occupy the house left empty by those deaths? It is generally accepted that between 75 to 95% of the Aboriginal people in the so-called New World died from the diseases brought by the newcomers. If the estimates of population before contact are accurate, that would mean that anywhere between 67 to 106 million Aboriginal people died. At first, the spread of these diseases were unintentional, but later there are documented records that show infected smallpox blankets were given to the Aboriginal peoples to help kill them off. Think of the result if your city, your town, or your village today lost 75 to 95% of the population. Lost would be your leaders, your artists, your teachers, your warriors, your sacred ceremony carriers, your healers, your historians, and the elders who carry much knowledge. No one could deny that this would have a devastating effect on those few remaining. The Aboriginal nations of the Americas are no different. This had a huge impact since the majority of Aboriginal cultures had oral histories. In most cases, there would have been few records to preserve and help rebuild detailed aspects of their history, culture, and belief system. It grieves me to think of how much we have lost. Instead of trying to quash century-old civilizations, traditions, and beliefs, think how much better the world would be if we had combined all the best parts of our collective wisdom for everyone's benefit. I think of the Aboriginal philosophers, the historians, the medicine men, the healers, and all other Aboriginal leaders and people whose knowledge and wisdom is now diminished because of the newcomer attempt to totally obliterate the Aboriginal cultures. The grief is immeasurable. Chapter 4. What if the newcomers began to fill the house and outnumber your family? Does that make the house theirs? When two cultures clash, usually the dominant culture forces their ways of living on the ones who are outnumbered. This is what happened with so many newcomers coming into the Americas. With the diseases devastating the Aboriginal communities, their laws, their way of life, and their culture were gradually being oppressed. This did not mean that Aboriginal people did not object to this. There are oral and written records that show there were major objections despite the trauma they were going through. There never was consent, even in those critical periods, to turn over the territories to the newcomers. Chapter 5. What if eventually you are displaced in the garage and the newcomers take over the rest of the house? Is it theirs? The traditional lands that the Aboriginal people occupied for thousands of years were claimed by the newcomers. Aboriginal people were placed on small pieces of land that no one else wanted. Laws that applied to Indians and Indian reserves were enforced to keep them restrained in every way. Aboriginal people were not only displaced from their land, but the economy that had sustained them from the land became difficult to obtain. A different economy was brought in by the newcomers that exploited the land and in many cases destroyed the resources upon which Aboriginal people depended. Money and wealth were the drivers to this economy. This is the total opposite to the Aboriginal people's economy. This today is still the biggest clash of cultures that exists. I believe there can be a balance between the two economies, but a serious look at how resource extraction is done is way overdue. Chapter 6. What if the newcomers ignore your house rules and impose their own? Does ownership of the house transfer without your consent? Even though Aboriginal people had their own laws, the newcomers brought their laws from across the ocean and later imposed them on the Aboriginal people. Once the newcomers established their government in the name of the Crown, they actively denied Aboriginal rights in countless ways. Aboriginal leaders were thrown in jail. Lawyers were banned when court action was organized. Laws were imposed to segregate Aboriginal people on reserves, keeping us out of sight and out of mind to the rest of Canada. Aboriginal people have been fighting against these human rights violations right from the start. There was no consent from Aboriginal people for any of this. You can't legally take someone's house without their consent. The laws are set up to protect anyone from this, and so too was the foreign law set up to protect Aboriginal territories from unlawful occupation. The Royal Proclamation specifically spoke to this, but the newcomers ignored their own laws. 7. This is a chapter in the book that Bill writes, and he'll speak a little later. Chapter 7. What if the newcomers finally agreed to sit down and talk? Should their opinions about ownership be more valid? The view of ownership to Aboriginal territories has never wavered in our communities. When the Canadian Constitution was patriated from England in 1982, Aboriginal people made sure it was only on the condition that 4 conferences be held to define Aboriginal and treaty rights for the Indian, for the Inuit, and ultimately the Métis people as well. The first Constitutional Conference held in Ottawa on the 15th and 16th of March 1983 successfully amended Canada's new Constitution to include the clause 35(1) that states, "Existing Aboriginal title and treaty rights shall hereby be recognized and affirmed." This section was protected by Section 25(1) of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the so-called non-obstante clause, which was required to have Section 35 protected from court cases alleging inequality with other Canadians. The later conferences to define what 35(1) meant were not successful. The governments felt that it was an empty box that needed to be filled. The Aboriginal people felt that it was a full box, and they would negotiate on what could be removed or altered. The importance of this only amendment to the 1982 Canadian Constitution can be seen in the many successful court cases in favor of Aboriginal people. Also, the documentary Dancing Around the Table, which examines the Constitution talks and the role Aboriginal leaders played in all four conferences, is very revealing about the fight that Aboriginal people continuously have to pursue. This documentary needs to be a part of Canadian curriculum as well, and Bill and his mum are featured in that. Chapter 8. What if the newcomers agreed to negotiate terms of settlement? Should they be allowed to keep changing the rules without your consent? Just as the Indian Act was continually changed to try to keep the Aboriginal people in line, so too has the BC treaty process in British Columbia. Aboriginal people were anxious to finally get to the negotiating table. And Bill can speak to what the BC treaty process was originally intended for negotiations, but once again we find ourselves at an uneven negotiating table. The powers that be have no desire to change the status quo and simply want the treaties to be what the government want and not what Aboriginal people really need to make the positive changes in their communities. As Bill says, we are not looking for a bigger cell with a better view in a federal prison. We want to bust out of this prison and achieve freedom. There are a few First Nations in BC who have signed treaties, and good for them. But other areas like my area, there are real challenges to getting a treaty that even looks remotely like a just and fair treaty. And so, struggle continues. Chapter 9. What if you are forced to appeal to newcomer institutions and laws to try to get your house back? Does that justify legal transfer of the house to them without your consent? The law changed in 1951 so that lawyers were able to represent us in court. And even though we would have preferred to settle this in a civilized way with both sides sitting down and negotiating our places in this country, Aboriginal people have been forced to use the foreign legal system to advance our human rights. Since 1951, Aboriginal people have won over 150 major court cases in regard to their land and basic human rights. It is interesting that the same people who are supposed to look after the best interests of the Indians are the same people who have spent probably billions over the years fighting us in court. If all of the people supposedly looked after the best interests of Aboriginal people and were really doing what they say they are set up to do, Aboriginal people should be the most well-off people in Canada, but the opposite is the reality. Chapter 10. What if the court says that the house is yours? Can you take it back? It is unrealistic to think that everyone who obtained title to the land is going to just let it go once they know the history. One court decision says we are all here to stay, and that is reality. So now we must decide how we are going to live together while respecting everyone's rights, and that definitely includes Aboriginal people of this country. 11. What do you need to fix your house now that it's yours again? What can newcomers do to help? Aboriginal people want to make their communities whole again. In order to become whole again, we need to fully regain control of our lives. We can't have others making decisions for us. We also need access to the resources in our territories, and we need a say in what happens in our territories. We were great caretakers before others arrived in this land, and I know that together with those who are now permanent residents in our territories, we can all be great caretakers for all of our grandchildren. My youngest daughter, who is in her final year of elementary school, got into trouble a few years ago for correcting her teacher on the history of this country. She knew what the teacher was saying was wrong and challenged her. My oldest son, Scott, and his wife, Crystal, were livid when they found out that Maya had gotten in trouble at school and contacted the principal. It became apparent to the school that Maya was right in challenging her teacher, and an apology was made. Maya, that same year, challenged her teacher again for saying something that was not accurate, but this time she didn't get into trouble. I wish I had that courage and wisdom at that age to do that, but now the facts of the real journey of Canada are coming out, and that is a good thing. My children and my grandchildren are very proud to be Aboriginal. They know their history and the contributions our people made. Maya and her sister Kiara were also aware at a very young age that certain things in the Aboriginal world were not right. I remember Maya probably at about the age of 9 watching a TV news show with me about a situation on an Aboriginal reserve. Her comment, without any prompting from me, said it all. She said, "That's not right," out of the mouths of babes. It reminds me of the comments by children in the United States on the remarks of Trump. They know what is right and what is not. I see the emergence of many young Aboriginal people who are politically aware, and that makes me both happy and sad. I know that our young people will continue to fight for their rights in the territories, but I wish it didn't have to be that way. I wish these young Aboriginal people could develop their natural talents instead of knowing they have an obligation to continue to fight for our human rights. Many people have asked me what reconciliation should be. I want the Aboriginal fight for survival to end. I want the contributions of the Aboriginal people to be fully recognized. I want Aboriginal people to once again become a necessary and contributing part of Canadian society. With understanding replacing ignorance, I believe that is possible, but it will take more than a few politicians to change our destiny. That is why I place my hope in the individual people of Canada who know the injustices and need to help educate others and help change Canada's future. And as I keep telling people who apologize to me for the injustices that are continuing to happen today, this is what I say. I know you are not personally responsible for these laws and policies, but now that you are aware, you have a responsibility to help change the situation. You cannot turn a blind eye to this, because if you do, you will be doing the same thing as your ancestors who made the policies. And I just want to end with Chief Dan George's words. And I think he said this on Canada's 100th birthday. This was a very small part of his speech. He said, "We are a people with special rights guaranteed to us by promises and treaties. We do not beg you for these rights, nor do we thank you. We do not thank you for them because we paid for them. And God help us, the price we paid was exorbitant. We paid for them with our culture, our dignity, and our self-respect. We paid and paid and paid." And now I'll turn it over to Bill. Thank you for listening.
Long way for me to walk. Thank you very much, Bev, and thank you very much for being here. A couple of things I want to mention. If you have the book, Bev's second book, and you have a look at the picture on the front. It was commissioned by the National Film Board to highlight the second conference. And what it is a stylized eagle, obviously, in a bird cage. And the bird cage is owned by Canada. And that was the artist's impression about what Indians were trying to do. Indians, Inuit, and Métis people were trying to do, was to get the hell out of this federal bird cage. Anyway, I've got the original on my wall, and I'll gladly take it down when Indians are free. Could be a while, I suppose. I want to make a couple of personal comments. I came to school here 55 years ago. This building, of course, was not here. But I did take my first political science class from Dean Henry Angus, after whom this building, of course, is named. And then I went on to less important studies like law school. But I got to say something, you know, when I was in school here, this was 1962, there weren't any Indians. There weren't even any East Indians. There weren't any women. Maybe 1 out of 100. Now it looks like there's almost 50% of the population in this room are women. Now that's progress to me. But I got to tell you something else. I went through 8 years of university, including my law degree. And never once was I ever in a class with another Indian. Can you imagine that? I never saw another Indian. I was only the second Indian to graduate from the University of British Columbia Law School. My uncle, Alfie Scow, being the first, some 17 years before I did. Anyway, I applaud he and the others, my brothers, my sisters, other people that came before me, but they weren't here when I was here. But I've got to tell you something, Dean, what was the dean's name? The famous Dean, Walter Gage. It was in a class similar to this, only a little older, a little bigger in the arts building. And I was late and I came through the door and Walter Gage had started his Math 120 class, which was a prized class to get into. If you were a math genius, which I was, you could get into this class, but you had to be good. Otherwise he wouldn't have you there. And he was a no-nonsense kind of guy, and I tried to sneak in the back, and he went, "Excuse me." And I went, "Yes, sir?" And he said, "What's your name?" I said, "Wilson." "What's your number?" I said, 9461621, sir. "Okay, there's a seat up there next to that beautiful young Japanese girl. Now, if you could sit down, shut up, I'll get on with my lesson." And then he went, "Hold it. What did you say your name was?" I said, "Wilson." He said, "Is Cal Wilson your brother?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Is Rusty Wilson your brother?" I said, "Yes, sir." "Is Donna Wilson your sister?" I didn't know where he was going with this, and I said, I thought I got into admitting to something that was not a good thing to admit to. And I said, "Yes, they're all my brothers and sisters." "Well," he said, "if you're half as smart as either one of them, we're going to get along really well." But that was Dean Walter Gage in those days. And we got along very, very well. At some point I'll tell you all the other stories about the times we had together. But one thing that I just wanted to say to you is that in those days you were paying rapt attention to the professors, even though many of them weren't worth it. I mean there were as many brilliant professors as there were shitty professors. But there was that kind of respect, and there wasn't a diversion. And I'm glad that the cell phones were asked to be turned off, because I think they're the dumbest thing in the world. And they are now producing the third generation of illiterate people. People stopped reading. I live in the West End down near the Sylvia, and I tell you, I'm surprised that more than 10 people a day aren't run over, because they got no idea where they're going or what they're doing. Yeah, across the street now. Yep, I'm on the other side now. Anyway, that's my pet peeve for the day. I find them to be incredibly expensive wastes of time. But nevertheless, not being able to afford one, I guess I'm just prejudiced. I wanted to say, though, that the population has changed very much. Many races, many orientations, sexual orientations, that were probably always there, certainly always there, but they weren't coming out and they weren't respected. And I think that's progress. 55 years ago, I came on campus and I remember somebody asking me, "Are you looking for work?" And I said, "No." "Well, you already have a job?" And I said, "Well, I'm a student." And they said, You're a student here on campus?" I said, "Yes." "Oh, athletics. I guess you must be in physical education." That was the common response from even the professors, despite the fact that I had graduated from high school with the highest marks in the history of the Comox Valley, 98.6. I came to school with 99.99 percentile in science, and they all thought I was a janitor. That was the kind of respect that was due to Aboriginal people. And that was the kind of relationship that the society had set up in order to intimidate people, in order to keep them down. And I'm afraid that a lot of it still remains. Institutionalization of oppression through the churches, obviously, but through the Department of Indian Affairs still exists to the nth degree. And I'd be willing to bet you that if you went home and asked your parents, who would be half my age, what they thought about Indians, you probably would get about a 50-50 negative response. Simply because they don't know, or didn't know, or weren't exposed to it. Now, I had the luxury of going to school because my dad was very wealthy and my mother was very wealthy, both full-blooded Indians. And as you can tell, they were obviously good looking. No, I don't make any excuses for the fact that I'm beautiful. And I got to tell you something, that I was also an athlete. I was a soccer superstar. And my biggest problem at university was running away from girls. Girls never liked to run away. But I just like teasing people. And I've got to tell you that Indian people in the province of British Columbia and across the country have constantly struggled just to get recognition as individuals, just as human beings. My father died in 1959, 1 year before he became a Canadian citizen, because Indians didn't get the vote federally until 1960. Now, my father employed 300 or 400 white people. Without my father, they would not have had a job. And my father was never a citizen. Now, can you think about this? My father managed to find an honest lawyer. Think about that. He made a deal with a guy named Ryland, who was a white man, but he was a citizen, whereas my father wasn't. So my father couldn't contract, because he was not a person in the eyes of the law. So Ryland made a deal with my father that if he took 20% off the top, he would contract in my father's name. So they shook hands, and that's what happened. And Ryland became an extremely wealthy man, as did my father. Now, but the only way that he got respect in our community, the Comox Valley, is because he had money to spend. He was spending $1,000 a week on clothing and sundries and food and other things in the valley. And that's the only reason the white merchants gave him any respect. They didn't invite him to their clubs or anything like that. I wanted to mention that. That's not new history. That's 1960, think about that. And the Indians in the province of British Columbia didn't get the vote until 1948. The first election was 1949, and Frank Calder, a Nisga'a guy, got elected. And that's where I'd like to start, hopefully it'll be a little short in this, lead up to the Constitutional Conference. Indians had been fighting to have their land claims recognized since, the Nisga'a would say, time immemorial. My first exposure to land claims was when I was 4 or 5 years old, and the Indian leaders of the province of British Columbia came to my father's house to get money, because there was no government money in those days. My father had an interest in foreshore rights because he was a fisherman, so he paved the way of the Brotherhood and other organizations because he wanted to have a piece of the action. And these beautiful men came in their Sunday suits, climbed out of 2 Packards, and they came and started talking land claims, land claims, land claims, land claims. And I listened. Everybody was outside playing, but I was listening. And that's where it got me in here. I was first elected to my first political position when I was 12. I was the youth advisor to the Native Brotherhood of British Columbia. And it's been in the blood ever since, but it was always land claims. This land belongs to us, lock, stock, and barrel. That's what James Gosnell said to Trudeau at the 1983 Constitutional Conference. And it's still the truth. But we have had to struggle just for recognition. You imagine being not a person and no one listening to you. Imagine not being able to contract. Imagine not being able to hire a lawyer. Imagine not being able to travel. And then imagine compounding that with residential schools in the aftermath of that. And also the Department of Indian Affairs, or whatever they call those prostitutes now. The reality is that the Department of Indian Affairs was created to make darn sure that Indians didn't progress. It was to confine you to federal penitentiaries, they call them Indian reserves, on the lousiest pieces of land, except for the fortunate few who did get decent land. Now you have the opportunity to do what? Nothing. You literally had to, my father's reserve is 3 miles from Campbell River, it's in Cape Munch. But the Indian agent's office was 120 miles north. Now, in order to go from my father's reserve to visit his relatives on the Campbell River Indian Reserve, he had to get a pass from the Indian agent who was 150 miles away. So how do you do that? First of all, how do you get off the reserve? Because you've got to have a pass to get off the reserve. So obviously you were put in prison. And that didn't change until 1951. But I want to tell you, the land claims issue was burning in the hearts not just of me, but of all Indian people who were active in politics. And we constantly pursued it. The province of British Columbia denied Aboriginal title and treaty rights. They said if it ever did exist, it was extinguished. If it wasn't extinguished, it lapsed at the time of Confederation. If it didn't lapse at the time of Confederation, it's a federal responsibility, and we're not going to have anything to do with it. From Trutch on, Trutch was the advisor, right up to, it was Van der Zand, believe it or not. In that period of time, Indian claims to the land of the province of British Columbia and the resources that are on the land were denied whole bullets. No, you don't have any rights. And so the struggle was, of course, to get some recognition for that. And we pursued the court cases, we pursued lobbying. But why would the Prime Minister talk to you if you weren't even a citizen? You don't get a vote, so who gives a shit what you think? And that's basically what happened to Indian people for many years. And then fortunately some White and Bob, the Nanaimo case, St. Catherine's Milling case, various other court cases started to itch away and chip away. And then, not the penultimate case, but the big case was Calder versus the Attorney General of the province of British Columbia. And even though they lost in the Supreme Court of Canada, by one vote by Pigeon, federal court, or not, he was a French-Canadian fellow who said we didn't have a fiat to sue the government. Now think about this. In order to sue the provincial government for a wrong that the provincial government had committed, we had to ask the provincial government if we could sue you. That's about as stupid as going for a pass to Alert Bay. At any rate, Calder et al., thanks to Hall's judgment, the renowned judgment in regard to Aboriginal title and treaty rights, he said, Trudeau changed his opinion. Actually, right here in Vancouver, in the Armory on Burrard Street, he said that the Aboriginal people of this country have more rights than we had previously assumed. And we are ready to sit down now and negotiate certain claims. They were negotiating 6 claims at a time. Well, of course, it's going to take forever, how many nations there are in the country, to negotiate that kind of claim. But the Nisga's were already negotiating through a separate process. And then ultimately, they decided to patriate the Constitution in '82. And Harry Daniels and Joe Mathias, Del Riley, and various other people pressured the English government to add the codicils to the patriation, that 4 conferences should be held with the Aboriginal people to define Aboriginal title. And I was fortunate enough to be involved in the lead up to that, and fortunate as well to be involved sitting across the table from Trudeau, who next to me was the smartest guy at the table. He was literally brilliant. I mean, whatever you think about he and his son, he was the most brilliant white politician that's ever been in Canada. And I've met all of them. We met with the premiers, most of whom couldn't get a job sweeping floors in my office. But Richard Hadfield, brilliant guy. René Lévesque, a brilliant man. At any rate, the Constitutional Conference of '83 produced the amendment that existing Aboriginal title and treaty rights shall be hereby recognized and affirmed. And then it was protected by 25(1), the non-obstante clause. Now, what grew out of that was the whole issue of, like, what does this mean? Well, what it means is that Indian people have the previous rights, or more rights than they previously thought. Now you got to talk to the Indians. You know, now there's a constitutional amendment that says Indians have rights. You can't ignore them anymore because they can go to court. Now, since that amendment, Bev talks about the number of cases. Court cases based on 35(1) have all been successful. Now it's gotten to the point, thanks to the Honeyquatine case up in the Williams Lake Chilcotin area, where approval with advised consent is what exists. Now, for me, that's as close as we'll ever come to complete consent, complete denial if we want to deny it. So that's where we've come with regard to the constitutional discussions. And I praise all of those old guys. And sadly, they were all old guys. There were no women in those days. I mean, there were women, but they weren't the leaders in those days. But I remember all those guys, Guy Williams and Frank Calder, Gosnell, Jimmy Seaweed and all the rest of them. If they were alive now, they would have fulfilled their dream. Because now you can't do anything on Indian land in any big way without advised and informed consent of the Aboriginal nation. That's a victory. Now it's to be sorted out. What are we going to do? And naturally what the Department of Indian Affairs wants to do is distract us. Now they're talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I believe, not as a residential school survivor, but as an Indian that's concerned about the well-being of Aboriginal people, that there has to be something done. Not just the money given out or the hearings taking place. Reconciliation to me, and if you want to look it up when you get the right to look at your phone again, is to reluctantly give in to something you don't want to do. That's what reconciliation means. But the churches, remember, the same people that put us in the residential schools, are trying to tell us that they want to reconcile. Well, I'll tell you, if somebody whipped me, incarcerated me, and raped me, there wouldn't be any reconciliation. And I certainly wouldn't embrace the same people that produced the atmosphere that allowed those things to take place against Aboriginal people. So I'm very, very doubtful about reconciliation, but I do know that we are at a point where Indian people's opinions matters. It always mattered. It was just never recognized. Anyway, I'm thankful to those people, and some of you may have relatives that have done that kind of stuff. We're there, like the door is partially open. All we need now is some strong Indian leader that looks like me to kick the door down. No, he doesn't have to look like me. She can look like you. Anyway, I imagine we'll have some questions. I can tell you some jokes.
Does anybody have any questions for Bill or for Bev? Maybe they do want a joke.
Oh, there's a question right there. Up there.
Kirsten, go.
Young fellow in the gray hair.
So, as students, what would you think would be the best step for us to do in order to work on this problem? Let's say while we're in school, and maybe next 5 years once we graduate.
Read Bev's books. That's a start. That's a good start. I mean, if you're an activist, you want to be involved, and the reality is that you've got to learn more and more about it. You see, because even among the Indians in the province of British Columbia, there's a dispute, between treaty and non-treaty, and consent, and where does it lie, where does it run? I mean, but the reality is that there is a weapon there now, in Honeyquatine in particular, that can be used by an organized group of people, hopefully the tribal group, to assert their rights in regard to the land and the resources. And you know where the fight will come, and Bev can talk about this. The fight is going to come with regard to mining and mineral resources, because that's where the desecration of the land can and probably will take place. Bev, by the way, lives about 25 miles away from where Mount Polly dam fell in. So by continuing to read and fortunately now there is other mediums, APTN and other things like that, where you can get what Indian people are up to, but not enough of it. You should come to this session like every day for the next week. No, I mean, by being informed is the best thing. I mean, the reality is that also informing other people around you, your friends or maybe your parents or other people, because I've been in a struggle, not necessarily just the Indian one, but I hear racist comments from people even today, but in the old days in the 60s there were homophobic comments and other comments like that I've kicked the shit out of people for. I don't recommend you do that, otherwise you end up looking like me, but the reality is that if somebody's stupid, you got to tell them. You got to tell them, I'm sorry, you're wrong. I'm going to go and see, what's his name, the guy with the comb over.
And I think also there's an election coming up, and I've been encouraging people to make Aboriginal issues and treaties in BC fair and just treaties, not just treaties that the government wants. Make go to the politicians, the people that are running, and make that an issue. Because it's not going to be the politicians. The politicians are only going to change and think about it when the people that vote them in know that it's an issue. So that's one way that you can help.
I need to be held up.
Oh, okay. There was a question up here.
You answered my question.
Oh, okay. All right.
I respect art in the sense that you've written this book and stuff, and the book Missing Sarah, and I recently, not recently, but a couple years ago heard about the 69 missing women, and I came from Africa not knowing anything about Canada, And when I heard about this, I saw that this artist, I'm not too sure if you're familiar with this, but this artist had found out about the 69 missing women, and she decided to create huge, like life-size paintings of them. So there was a documentary made about it, and these pictures were actually going to be put in the Museum of Anthropology. And there became this huge dispute by the Aboriginal people saying, how dare you steal these mugshots? They were mugshots. So how dare you take these pictures and put them up for like, like monetary use, or like how dare you commercialize these things? I was just wondering, like, what would be your say as Aboriginal people? Would you allow for something like that to be showcased, or do you not want people to use that?
You know, that's for the people, the families of the missing and murdered women, and it's more than 69. I think officially there's over 1,200, but there's a lot more than that where Aboriginal women, are when they die and there's an autopsy, it's just kind of brushed under the rug and whatever. So there's a lot more than that, but I can't speak to that. I don't know what you're talking about. But if I had someone who was murdered or is missing and they used a picture of my relative, I sure as heck would want to be either say yes or no, or they can't just go and do that. And see, that's the problem, is people think they can just go and just do whatever they want, like with all of the regalia that was confiscated from when the potlatch. You tell better than I do.
Well, first of all, it's back to consent, isn't it? I mean, I think that there should be as much publicity as possible in regard to the murdered and missing Aboriginal women and men. Remember, people seem to forget this. Not as many men were murdered and are missing, but if there's one, that's too many. So any kind of publicity, but it has to be with informed consent. I mean, you can't just go and do it without people. Like my sister was murdered. She was blown away by a white guy, double-barreled shotgun. And if I could show the massacre that occurred there, I would gladly sign it. I don't have that authority, but that happened when I was in law school, for Christ's sake. But and then there's 1,000 other stories about that. But it's not just the murder and the missing. I mean, it's the whole psyche of how can you possibly think you can get away with this, you bastard? And that's the attitude that we've got to get rid of. Like our women are Aboriginal women just throwaways? I'm afraid that's what they are in terms of a hell of a lot of people. My sister's murder was never prosecuted. That's just 45 years ago. And there's been all kinds of Aboriginal women and Aboriginal men and other people, who have gone missing or have done things too that nobody in those days ever cared about. And now that attitude still prevails. You see, I believe there might even be some people in this room that think they're as good as I am. But you see, that's how it starts. It's that if there's a history of looking down on people, and women know this better than I would, there's a history of looking down on people, and the practice continues and continues to treat them that way, then they're going to continue to be treated in that manner, which is less than what the ordinary person needs to be treated. You've got to establish mutual respect and dignity. Doesn't matter what your sexual orientation is, doesn't matter what the color of your skin is, and I'll extend it to you, you extend it to me, and we'll get along. But if you want to continue to think that you're better than I am, we aren't going to get along. And that's where the stupid part comes. Because ignorant people, not saying that, because ignorant people always need someone to scapegoat and look down on, so they can feel slightly better about their embittered little lives. And I'm afraid that's where all racism originates. It originates in stupidity and ignorance. And then very often, let's put her down. And that's the way the history's been, we can see it in the United States. You get a bozo elected president, because he was able to appeal to the racist ignorance of people who have never voted. Brilliant on his part as a strategist, but what does it say about civilization? If somehow we can appeal to the lowest common denominator to achieve the highest political office in the world. Well, I hope he only stays 4 years, if that long. Bev says he's going to be impeached, but you see, we've got to put everybody at the same level. Nobody's better than anybody, nobody's worse than anybody. I mean, I tease you because I know I'm better than you are. No, but I know I'm not. I mean, but you'll never convince me that I'm not. But if push came to shove and there was a competition between you and I'd consider you an absolute equal and stand up for whatever fight you had. We don't do that. You know, we go over to the side and go, yeah, well, she always was a bit of a bitch. No. There's a grievance here, let's deal with it. Let's get on with dealing with people as human beings. And I don't know where it comes from. Yeah, I know where it comes from.
Any other questions? Yeah?
So, as a woman who grew up in more of an Aboriginal community, how do you think that your experience compared to someone like me, just as a woman growing up, I guess from childhood through adulthood? Because I know, like, as a woman, we experience things that, like, men don't. Would you say that your experience as a woman in the Aboriginal community may have been different from mine growing up in a white community?
Yes, I think so, because, I mean, I was chief of my community, and the only time it was an issue that I was a woman and I was chief was when I left my community. I mean, the women in our community are very strong, and in every Aboriginal community, the women are the backbone of the community, and they might not be in elected positions, and they might not, you know, be recognized as leaders, but they are. And so I know that, and it was very hard for me when I started going out into the non-Aboriginal world. It was very hard for me. You know, this one white lady, she was an anthropologist, and she came to stay with me. And she was telling me, when we started talking about residential schools, and she says, next is the, what do they call the women's movement, the feminist or whatever. She said, next, that's the next battle. And I'm looking at her and I'm thinking, I didn't know what that was. So, you know, before the Aboriginal women were at least equal to, they didn't belong to their men, they didn't belong to anybody, they were at least equal to, and in matrilineal cultures like Bill's culture, they were the decision makers, you know, and when the newcomers came and forced the Indian Act, and they only recognized the men, and unfortunately some Aboriginal communities, you know, the guys were ill-informed and, you know, accepted that. But now it's going back again. So in my community, it wasn't an issue that I was a woman and that I was chief. And actually, most of the women, since we were allowed to vote, I can't, 1951, have been women. And as somebody said, it would be an issue if a woman didn't run for council. So I think that's the difference.
I have to tell you a quick story about my mother, who is obviously a brilliant woman. She was approached after the '83 Constitutional Conference by a French-Canadian reporter. And the reporter said to her, well, it's too bad, Ethel, you know, the equality provision did not go through. It was one of the 16 things we were talking about at the constitutional table. And Mom said, yeah? He said, well, don't you believe in equality? And my mother looked at her and said, listen, bitch, why would I take a step down? And that was the attitude of my mother and the women in our tribe. She said, the only way that men can be equal to women in our tribe is when they can have babies and raise them to be decent adults. That's what I was imbued with. I'm no advocate for women, but I know my place.
Any other questions? Uh-huh.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your writing process that went into Price Paid.
Oh, Price Paid. My writing process, when I first started, I'll go to my first book first, because when I first started, and it didn't connect with me as an adult how my childhood affected me. It was only in the late 1980s and 90s when our tribal council did a research study about the effect of the about the effect of social conditions in our communities. Like we were wondering, why do we have so many social problems? You know, we didn't understand it. And so Roland Christian from the University of Guelph came in, and he was doing a research thing, and all roads led back to the residential school. And so it was only then that I started connecting my childhood with my adult years, and you know, like little light bulbs started going on, and I would write, you know, I'd be on the bus or I would be driving and I would pull over or something, and I'd little things like, I can't think of an example right now, but I would be thinking in little things that I would connect to my childhood and how I was. And so I ended up with quite a stack of little notes. And it was when I gave Bill to read, and he didn't know anything about residential schools. Both his mom and dad had gone to Port Alberni, but they didn't talk about it with him, or Alert Bay, and they didn't talk about it with him, and I understood that. Because if you went to a residential school, it was like we were in a secret society. We didn't talk about it with people that hadn't gone. I didn't talk to my kids. My grandmother, who was born in 1896, and my mom, born in 1925, both went to the school, and I talked to them about it. And because we didn't have to explain to each other all the pain that we were feeling, you know, but when I talked to my kids or somebody else, they would start asking questions, and I would have to go deep. I would have to, you know, and I didn't want to do that. And it was years before I, you know, could talk about it without breaking down, and it has become easier. But anyways, once I started connecting them, then I ended up with a whole bunch of little stories, and I asked Bill if he wanted to read it, and he said, yeah. And he was just absolutely amazed, you know, because he didn't know what went on behind the closed doors of the school. So I had a whole bunch of stories, little stories, but I didn't know it didn't look like a book at all. So what I did was I hired an editor, and I think he's called a structural editor, where he took all of my stories, and I think he had my notes for about a month and a half, and he sent me back this thing that looked like a book. I was like, oh my God, it's a book. So that was my process of writing, is just writing all the little stories. My second book was actually a presentation. It was a oral presentation that I put together because when I went to work for the BC Treaty process, or BC Treaty Commission, I quickly realized that the people that were negotiating at the table had no idea of the history. You know, they were just there talking about provincial stands or federal stands, and even some of the Aboriginal people didn't know. You know, so I put together this historical presentation, and Mike Harcourt was there. He's the former premier, and he asked me to do my presentation, and he sat through it, and he wanted me to turn it into a book, and but he left shortly after that, and then I kind of forgot about it. So when Talon Books was looking for a second book, I did the presentation for them, and they were excited about it. So I'm not a writer, you know, and I am going to write more books, but it's, like I said, it's not because I'm a writer, it's because it's necessary, and it's necessary for other Indigenous people to become writers as well. So that's my process. It's no, people ask me to talk about it and teach, and I'm like, I don't know how to teach it. I don't know what.
Yeah, I want to tell them one story.
What? Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to, I think all that stuff is, you know, all deadly serious. Everybody takes themselves serious, and you should, you know, I mean, but I remember my 60 years in Indian politics, the most fun I ever had was laughing at each other, telling jokes to each other and stories. And I'm writing another book, 3 now that I haven't published yet. But the 3rd book is on Indian humor, or humorous things that happened to me in, the 60 years that I traveled the country. And we were in Ottawa with Trudeau, the old Trudeau. And he was chairing a meeting. We were discussing the right of non-status and Métis people to Aboriginal title. Contentious issue, good big population. Anyway, we argued. Finally, he said to me, "Well, Bill, I think that," or Mr. Wills, he never called me Bill, "I think that you convinced me. We will include Aboriginal people, Métis, and non-status Indian people in the constitutional discussions." And then he noticed that there was this old fellow, not old, but a little older than me. His name was Ed Head, and he was a trapper from northern Manitoba. And he'd been paying attention and everything, but he hadn't contributed, hadn't said anything here. And Trudeau was a bit of an asshole, but the most brilliant one you're ever going to meet. I mean, clearly was one of the most brilliant people. He said to Ed Head, he said, "Can you describe succinctly for me the concept of Aboriginal title, Mr. Head?" And he was just trying to go out showing off Trudeau. And Ed said to me, "What's succinct mean, Bill?" I said, "Short, quick, concise." "Yep, I can." And then Trudeau just sat there for a minute, and he said, "Oh." He said, "Well, would you?" And Ed said, "Oh, you mean right now?" And he goes, "Yes, would you?" "Yes." "No, now." "Yeah, yes." And he went, "Okay. It's our land. Fuck off." True story. An absolutely true story. I'm sorry for the word, but that, and Trudeau just went, "Well, I did ask for succinctness."
And on that note, if there are no further questions, I'd like to thank Bev and Bill so much for coming and